Marco Rubio walked into a closed-door meeting with Ursula von der Leyen, carrying something far more dangerous than a diplomatic agenda. He was carrying proof, documented, verified, intelligence-backed proof that the European Union had been running a double game against the United States for years. And when he placed that proof on the table in front of the most powerful, unelected official in the Western world, something happened that nobody in Brussels was prepared for. Von der Leyen went silent. In a perfect world, all of these problems and more would be solved by diplomats and strongly worded resolutions. But we do not live in a perfect world, and we cannot continue to allow those who blatantly and openly threaten our citizens and endanger our global stability to shield themselves behind abstractions of international law, which they themselves routinely violate. This is the path that President Trump and the United States have embarked upon. It is the path we ask you here in Europe to join us on. It is a path we have walked together before and hope to walk together again. For 5 centuries before the end of the Second World War, the West had been expanding. Its missionaries, its pilgrims, its soldiers, and its explorers poured out from its shores to cross oceans, settle new continents, and build vast empires extending across the globe. But in 1945, for the first time since the age of Columbus, it was contracting. Europe was in ruins. Half of it lived behind an iron curtain, and the rest looked like it would soon follow. The great Western empires had entered into terminal decline, accelerated by godless communist revolutions and by anti-colonial uprisings that would transform the world and drape the red hammer and sickle across vast swaths of the map in the years to come. Against that backdrop, then as now, many came to believe that the West's age of dominance had come to an end, and that our future was destined to be a faint and feeble echo of our past, but together, our predecessors recognized that decline was a choice, and it was a choice they refused to make. This is what we did together once before, and this is what President Trump and the United States want to do again now, together with you. And this is why we do not want our allies to be weak, because that makes us weaker. We want allies who can defend themselves so that no adversary will ever be tempted to test our collective strength. This is why we do not want our allies to be shackled by guilt and shame. We want allies who are proud of their culture and their heritage, who understand that we are heirs to the same great and noble civilization, and who together with us are willing and able to defend it. And this is why we do not want allies to rationalize the broken status quo rather than reckon with what is necessary to fix it. For we in America have no interest in being polite and orderly caretakers of the West's managed decline. We do not seek to separate, but to revitalize an old friendship and renew the greatest civilization in human history. A politician, choosing her words carefully, the silence of someone who has just watched the entire foundation of their power get pulled out from underneath them in real time. What Rubio revealed in that room did not just embarrass the European Commission. It exposed something so fundamental, so deliberately concealed, and so catastrophic in its implications that senior EU officials are now privately saying the same thing in whispered conversations across Brussels, Paris, and Berlin. That the European Union they built, the institution they protected, and the project they spent decades expanding may not survive what is coming next. To understand why this moment is different from every previous confrontation between Washington and Brussels, you have to understand what Europe believed about itself going into this meeting. For the better part of 3 decades, the European Union operated on a single unshakable conviction, that it had made itself indispensable, not just economically, not just militarily through NATO, but institutionally and ideologically. European leaders genuinely believed that the rules-based international order they championed, the regulatory frameworks they constructed, and the multilateral institutions they dominated had created a situation where America simply could not afford to treat Europe as anything less than an equal partner. That belief did not emerge from nowhere. It was carefully cultivated, deliberately reinforced, and institutionally embedded into every level of European political thinking over generations of policymaking. And Ursula von der Leyen was its purest expression. She built her entire tenure as president of the European Commission on the assumption that Brussels had permanently graduated beyond the point where Washington could dictate terms. She lectured American administrations on climate policy. She imposed regulatory frameworks on American technology companies. She publicly positioned the European Union as the global standard setter for digital governance, artificial intelligence regulation, and democratic values, while simultaneously presiding over a continent that had spent decades refusing to fund its own military defense at the levels it had formerly committed to inside the very alliance that guaranteed its security. The arrogance was not incidental. It was structural. It was built into the architecture of how the European Commission understood its own role in the world. and Marco Rubio walked into that meeting specifically to dismantle it. What most people watching this crisis from the outside do not fully appreciate is the significance of who Rubio is in the context of this confrontation. This was not a political operative delivering partisan talking points. This was not a loyalist sent to perform public theater for a domestic American audience. Marco Rubio is one of the most deeply briefed foreign policy minds in the United States government, a former chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, a man who spent years reading classified assessments, intercepted communications, and documented evidence of what foreign governments were actually doing behind the scenes while their diplomats smiled across conference tables and signed joint communiques about shared values and transatlantic solidarity. When Rubio sits across from a foreign leader, he is not working from talking points prepared by a press office. He is working from files, and the files he brought to his meeting with von der Leyen contained information that the European Commission had every reason to believe would never be formally presented to them in a direct diplomatic confrontation, because exposing it required America to acknowledge the full extent of its intelligence penetration of European institutions, something previous administrations had consistently chosen to avoid in order to preserve the comfortable fiction of unconditional alliance. The Trump administration made a different calculation. The decision to send Rubio to Brussels with that material was not made lightly, and it was not made quickly. According to sources with direct knowledge of how the briefing was assembled, the intelligence package Rubio carried into that meeting had been months in preparation. Multiple agencies contributed to it. It was reviewed at the highest levels of the American national security apparatus before a single page was authorized for use in a diplomatic setting. The conclusion those reviews reached was unanimous. The evidence was not just credible, it was airtight. And the determination inside Washington was equally unanimous. Europe had been given informal warnings through back channels, through allied intelligence services, and through the deliberate public statements of Trump administration officials who repeatedly signaled that the era of consequence-free European behavior toward American interests was finished. Those warnings had been received, processed, and systematically ignored. Brussels had calculated that America was bluffing. Rubio's arrival in that meeting room was the moment America demonstrated with absolute finality that the calculation was wrong. The confrontation began before von der Leyen had finished her opening remarks. Sources present in the room describe a moment early in the meeting when Rubio placed a specific document in front of von der Leyen and asked her a direct question about its contents. The document related to financial transactions conducted through European banking institutions during a period when American sanctions on specific entities were fully enforced and fully known to European regulatory authorities. The transactions were not ambiguous. They were deliberate, structured, and designed with the specific purpose of allowing money to move between parties that American law explicitly prohibited from conducting business with each other. Von der Leyen looked at the document and, according to every account of what happened in that room, said nothing, not because she was composing a careful diplomatic response, but because there was no response available to her that would not make the situation dramatically worse than her silence already made it. What followed over the next several hours was not a negotiation, and it was not a dialogue. It was a presentation. Rubio walked von der Leyen through 3 categories of documented evidence, each one built on the last, each one more politically devastating than the previous, and each one representing not just a policy disagreement or a regulatory dispute, but a fundamental betrayal of the alliance framework that Europe had spent decades publicly celebrating while privately undermining. By the time Rubio reached the 3rd category of accusations, the atmosphere in that room had shifted from diplomatic tension to something that experienced observers of high-level international negotiations describe as total institutional collapse. The most powerful official in the European Union was sitting across from the American Secretary of State with no answers, no defenses, and no allies in the room capable of providing either. But what Rubio had presented in those first hours of the meeting was not even the most dangerous element of what he carried in Brussels that day. Because the documented evidence of past European behavior, as damaging as it was, represented only the foundation for what came next. And what came next was not a list of American grievances or a catalog of European failures. It was a deadline, a specific, non-negotiable, already decided timeline attached to consequences so severe that when the details become fully public, the financial panic currently building quietly beneath the surface of European markets will look like the calm before a storm. What exactly is on that timeline, and why did von der Leyen spend the 3 hours immediately following Rubio's departure not briefing European leaders? not activating crisis protocols, and not consulting the diplomats whose entire careers have been spent preparing for moments exactly like this one, but instead retreating behind closed doors with a group of private advisors whose names appear on no official European Commission document and whose loyalty is to something other than the European public they have never been accountable to. The 3 hours that followed Rubio's departure from that meeting will be studied by political historians as the moment European institutional leadership demonstrated with absolute clarity that it was never built to handle a crisis of this magnitude. Von der Leyen did not do what every emergency protocol inside the European Commission demands of its president when a diplomatic confrontation of this severity occurs. She did not convene the Emergency College of Commissioners. She did not place calls to the leaders of France, Germany, Italy, and Poland. She did not activate the European External Action Service, and she did not brief the presidents of the European Parliament or the European Council. Instead, she retreated behind closed doors, surrounded by a small circle of private advisors whose names do not appear on any official European Commission organizational chart. She spent 3 hours making decisions that will determine the fate of 450 million European citizens without consulting a single one of their elected representatives. The advisors she turned to in that moment are not unknown to the small community of Brussels insiders who track the informal power structures that actually govern European Commission decision-making beneath its carefully managed public image. What connects them is not institutional role or democratic mandate, but proximity to financial and regulatory decisions worth hundreds of billions of euros, decisions made with minimal parliamentary oversight and even less public transparency. The advice they gave von der Leyen in those 3 hours was not designed to protect European citizens from the consequences of the crisis Rubio had just detonated. It was designed to protect the institutional structures that give those advisors their influence and give von der Leyen her power. And the strategy they settled on was not just wrong. It was the precise response Washington had anticipated and was already positioned to exploit. The strategy was containment through narrative control. Do not acknowledge the severity of what Rubio presented. Do not allow the confrontation to be characterized as an institutional crisis, and deploy the machinery of European Commission communications to frame the meeting as routine diplomatic engagement. It was the same strategy the European Commission had successfully deployed through every previous crisis in its history. The fatal miscalculation was that this crisis was not European in origin. It was the United States of America, and Washington was not going to wait for the European news cycle. The first signs that something had gone wrong did not come from official channels, but from the sudden silence across the usual corridors of Brussels. Meetings that were supposed to begin were postponed without explanation. Scheduled press briefings were quietly removed from the calendar. And in several key European institutions, staff members reported being instructed to await further clarification without any indication of what that clarification would be. Within hours, fragments of what had occurred in the closed-door meeting began to circulate, not as confirmed statements, but as conflicting reports moving through diplomatic backchannels. Some described a confrontation. Others insisted it was a routine exchange that had been misinterpreted under pressure. But none of those explanations accounted for the abrupt change in tone coming from Washington, where senior officials had begun using language that left very little room for diplomatic ambiguity. Because what made this moment different was not just the meeting itself, but what followed it. According to accounts attributed to insiders familiar with the discussions, the United States had moved beyond discussion and into positioning. Financial oversight bodies were alerted, strategic trade assessments were updated, and contingency frameworks that had remained dormant for years were quietly reactivated in preparation for scenarios that until now had only existed in theoretical planning documents. In Brussels, the European Commission attempted to maintain composure, issuing carefully worded statements reaffirming ongoing cooperation and shared transatlantic priorities. But behind those statements, internal communications painted a very different picture, one of uncertainty, fragmentation, and an urgent search for consensus that did not yet exist. Member states reacted unevenly. Some governments demanded immediate clarification from the Commission. Others called for emergency consultations at the ambassadorial level. A few remained publicly silent, calculating the political cost of aligning too early with either interpretation of events. The unity that Brussels depended on in moments of external pressure began to show visible strain within hours, not days. Meanwhile, markets began to react in subtle but unmistakable ways. Not a collapse, not a panic, but hesitation, a recalibration of risk. Trading desks across London, Frankfurt, and New York flagged unusual patterns in European financial instruments tied to regulatory stability and cross-border compliance expectations. Analysts did not yet know what had changed, but they knew something had. And in Washington, the message being sent was no longer about alliance management. It was about leverage. The tone of briefings shifted from concern to control, from diplomacy to consequence. Officials close to the administration reportedly described the moment as a reset point in transatlantic relations, one where assumptions built over decades were no longer being treated as guarantees. Back in Brussels, von der Leyen's inner circle faced a narrowing set of options. A public confrontation risked exposing divisions that had not yet fully surfaced. Silence risked allowing the narrative to be defined entirely elsewhere. And any attempt to de-escalate privately now required engaging with a counterpart that had already demonstrated it was prepared to escalate further if necessary. What had begun as a closed-door meeting was no longer contained within a room or even within an institution. It had become a structural test of the entire post-war transatlantic order, one that neither side could afford to misunderstand, but neither side could fully control. And as night fell over Brussels, the question that lingered was not what had been said behind closed doors, but what would be made public next and who would move first when it was.